What is up, YouTube? I am back again to film another review for Agent Carter. In case you guys don't know me, I am the Mediator, aka Ben, and let's get started. So this is the 4th episode of Agent Carter, and it starts out with its little intro, Peggy being all like, I'm Peggy Carter, I'm doing stuff, and the episode starts out, there's a deal going down, and Jarvis is a part of it, which is a little confusing. But as the show goes on, there's a guy who's off to the corner, or like off to the side, and he's just kind of throwing a ball around when all of a sudden he disappears, but the ball rolls back. Now, things are getting a little suspicious, and one of the guys points a gun at Jarvis, and another guy goes to investigate what happens, but he's mysteriously taken down too. And 2 more come, and they're beaten up by none other than Agent Peggy Carter herself. Now, Jarvis is continuing this deal since nobody knows Peggy is taking down the other guys, and Jarvis's accusation is that he's being extorted. But eventually, he agrees to give these guys what they want, and they open up the briefcase, and all of a sudden, knockout gas comes out of it, and Peggy swoops in and takes down the guys. This is when they run into Howard Stark, who is hiding in a train playing pool by himself. He mentions the enemy of the episode, whose name is Mr. Mink, and when a guy tries to attack Peggy, Stark throws a pool ball at him and takes him down. Well, they start driving away, and they have some small talk, and then the car is stopped. Peggy points out that there's an SSR stakeout going down, and Peggy says that Stark made a really dumb decision by showing up again, since the SSR is looking for him. So she decides to hide him at the Griffith Hotel. In case you guys haven't been keeping up, the Griffith Hotel does not allow dudes in there. Ever. Considering it's an all-female establishment. It's really not a good idea. So they hide him in the laundromat, and just as Howard manages to get away, the manager of the Griffith Hotel shows up and asks Peggy where she's been. Peggy comes up with an excuse, and the manager leads her back to her room. The next scene is at the SSR. Thompson and Dooley are talking to each other, catching up on some information like the typewriter, which, as they've discovered, can send long message signals. And they also find that there's some intelligence that states that the Russians were beaten by a Nazi named Mueller, and Dooley decides that he's going to go interrogate him, which effectively leaves Thompson in charge. Back at the Griffith, the manager keeps ranting about how she's the only one keeping these girls from compulsion, saying that they don't have full control over their urges and that she's the one who has to be able to stop this. Well, just as Peggy's about to go into her room, she asks about the laundry. Well, Howard's in there. Or is he? See, Peggy goes to open the laundry door and finds that Howard isn't there. Well, she picks up her laundry and the manager leaves, and so she starts looking around for Howard. And it's like, Howard, where are you? He was in another girl's room. Typical Howard Stark. Well, Howard starts to talk with Peggy and makes some mention about how he wants to get food, and Peggy's like, there's no room service. Well, Howard says he wants to find out what is still out there, that is, in terms of his devices, and shows Peggy a new contraption, which is a camera pen. And Howard makes a joke about Peggy as she's changing clothes or whatever, asking if they're friends, right? And she slams the door in his face. Back at the SSR, Thompson asks what Krasinski's middle name was, or asks what the most important part of his name is, and someone says the middle name, and then asks what the important part is. And Thompson says that the most important part of his name is agent, and saying that while Dooley's away, people are not slacking off. They are agents of the Strategic Scientific Reserve, and they don't mess around. Sousa wants to be able to investigate the incident on the boat, but then is eventually shot down, and Peggy is told to get lunch orders for people. Well, Peggy's got stuff to do, so she goes down to the science lab and gives one of the workers the job to go get lunch orders, and she starts taking pictures around the lab with the camera pen. And there's this really hilarious scene going on where one scientist is always getting his lab coat on fire and the other is trying to take it out. Well, eventually Peggy gets what she needs and she leaves. Sousa goes to investigate at the dock and gets Prince off of the phone, and he decides to talk to two of the guys there. Well, he eventually has to pay them to get intel, and one of the guys says he doesn't talk to cops, and they start getting into a short fight. But Sousa uses his aluminum crutch to his advantage and arrests the guy. Well, the original henchmen from the beginning work for Mr. Mink, and as they're reporting to him, he says that they were beaten up. Well, Mr. Mink isn't too happy, and he whips out an automatic revolver and starts shooting one guy. And he says that results need to come, not excuses, essentially. He shoots the other guy in the leg, and the one guy tries to say, "I can go look for them, I can do better." And Mr. Mink is like, "It's far too late," and then shoots him. Peggy returns to her apartment, but finds that Howard's missing again. It turns out that he was in another room with another one of the residents at the Griffith. Back at the SSR, Sousa brings in the guy for interrogation, and Thompson makes a joke about how brilliant of an arrest it was, which was very sarcastic coming from Thompson. Back at the Griffith, Peggy makes one of the lights turn red, and they start looking back at film that she took from the camera pen. That's when Angie comes a-knocking, saying that it's time for dinner. Peggy explains to Howard that it's one of the advantages of group dining, and eventually leaves. Howard leaves his request for dinner, which Peggy just completely ignores. At the SSR, Sousa begins his interrogation. Now, he's not like Thompson and isn't prone to violence, but instead starts telling a story. In this story, Sousa explains that he had walked into a diner once, and people got up and started clapping for him, since he served in the military. But when another person who served in the military walked in, nobody cared. They weren't clapping for him like they were for Sousa. And that's when Sousa put it together. They were clapping for his crutch, and they were expressing how guilty they felt. They weren't clapping because he was in the military. He later goes on to say that nobody really cares about that kind of stuff, and that both Sousa and the guy that he's interrogating are people that nobody cares about. Well, the sympathy card doesn't really work with this guy he's interrogating. And the guy goes on to explain that his wife ended up sleeping with another man, but frankly, that's not a reason for him to all of a sudden want to talk to cops. And Sousa eventually gives up on this front. Back at the Griffith, Angie is stuffing food in her purse, and she later explains that there's a whole art to this. There's even one girl who has a tub of gravy that she can stuff in her pocketbook, and another girl asks if she can have one that's meant to hold pickles. Well, Peggy, after getting her food, walks back to her room, saying that she has to get back to her last couple pages of Agatha Christie. When she returns, Howard explains that they have to steal one of his inventions back. You see, all the weapons the SSR took were inactive, but if they were active, they would be catastrophic. Well, Howard explains that one of those weapons is actually active. It's called the Blitzkrieg button. Peggy explains it as a glorified light switch, and essentially, it activates or it shuts down all of the lights around the city forever. And if New York was hit by it, it would be sent back into the Stone Age. Well, Howard gives Peggy a decoy button so she can sneak into the SSR and trade them and get the real one back. Well, Peggy goes on her way with Jarvis, but they're followed by Mr. Mink on the way out. Back with Sousa, he begins round 2 of the interrogation, which is when Thompson steps in. Now, he's being rather obnoxious and is eating a burger and has a bottle of scotch on the table. Through this, he bribes the guy with food, and the homeless man explains that there was a woman on the boat. When immediately asked if the woman was blonde, he says no, but she had dark hair. Well, taking this information, Thompson walks out of the room, and Sousa follows him. Sousa explains, or wants to know, what Thompson did, and Thompson says that not everybody came back from the war wanting a hug. We go over to Dooley at the jail cell, and he talks about the Russians who didn't die. The guy in the cell that he's interrogating was in the war where this battle theoretically happened, but didn't. Well, Dooley wants to get answers out of the guy, and even makes a bribe. This is when we go over to Peggy and Jarvis, who are in the car. Jarvis seems a little on edge when he's explaining how the weapon works, and Peggy asks if he's okay. He says yes and keeps moving on. Peggy mentions that Howard might want to possibly use the weapon, but Jarvis flat out denies this. Throughout the whole time, he keeps rubbing his ear, which Peggy notes later on in the episode. And this makes her wonder what exactly is going on with Jarvis. Peggy makes mention that if the weapon is activated, no one would get hurt, and Jarvis says to just get it quickly. Back at Dooley says that these guys were dying, and in order to get answers from the guy in the jail cell, he presses a special button on his watch and shows 3 little cyanide packets, and explains that you can get out of this sticky situation if you give me answers. The guy in the jail cell explains that it wasn't a battle, but rather a massacre. He explains that once the German soldiers had gotten there, whoever killed them was long gone. But nobody believed it. The guy in the jail cell says that no one there had died by a German hand. Well, Dooley believes this and gives the guy a cyanide packet. Back at the SSR, Thompson and Sousa review the information, and they're talking about victories. And they make mention of Sousa's lead from his femur, explaining that he got his crutch from having a broken femur. At least, I think that's the message I wrote to myself. Well, back at the SSR with Peggy, she places the fake blitzkrieg button and starts to leave. But, like I mentioned earlier, she has a flashback to Jarvis rubbing his ear. Peggy starts to know that something is very weird about this, and she flips a switch. And once it opens, the blitzkrieg button is revealed to have a red vial in it. Well, this seems very strange. So she takes the vial and she starts to leave when she runs into Thompson. And Thompson flat out asks Peggy, "Why do you work here?" He later goes on to say that she's hiding something. But when she asks, he explains that she's hiding the natural order of the universe from herself. He goes on to explain that women are never going to be in the position that men are, so why do you even try? And Peggy says that she could always get the truth from Thompson and leaves in a huff. Outside the Griffith Hotel, Mink is sitting in his car watching as Peggy returns. Peggy goes to her room and talks to Howard and asks what the vial is. Howard does his best to try to get around the question, but Peggy is not taking this crap. She wants to know what this vial is. And Howard eventually explains that it's Captain America's blood. And right before they cut to commercial, Peggy punches Howard in the face. We come back, and Mr. Mink comes into the door, and he wants to deliver flowers to Peggy, but is shot down by the manager. She's going to leave Peggy a note saying that whoever this is was here and wants to know who he is. Mr. Mink simply explains that he's in love with Peggy, but when the manager goes to write this, he leaves. Back in Peggy's room, Peggy is so mad at Howard. She got played and feels super betrayed. Yeah, that rhymed. Howard says that there's a ceiling for certain people, kind of like the class system ceiling. So he lied and he cheated his way to the top. And that's just who he is. He goes on to explain that he was the lead scientist on the Project Rebirth, and says that the government is about to run out of its supply of blood, so he has it. He is one of the last remaining vials of Captain America's blood. Howard says that he can find a way to save the world, for finding cures for various diseases with Captain America's blood, and so on and so forth. Peggy just accuses Howard of being selfish, however, saying that he could make a major profit off of this. Peggy explains that Captain America was a very honorable man, and throughout this entire mission for Howard, she feels that she's forgotten her pledge to her country, the same that Captain America made for his. Well, this is when we see that someone is coming through the air vent in the hallway, and out comes Mr. Mink. Well, do you remember a girl named Dottie who came in last episode? Yeah, she starts talking to him, and it gets a little bit weird, because she asks about the automatic gun that Mr. Mink is holding, and asks if she can see it. Now, this is where it gets really weird. She jumps on him, kind of like the Black Widow in Iron Man 2. Jumps on his shoulders and immediately does a takedown and brings her into her room. Now, I don't think this is intended, but immediately during the scene, I thought of the Fort Knox metaphor that the manager kept making in the last episode, and it kind of fits. Well, we cut back after a commercial to Peggy walking down the street, and she's talking to Jarvis. Peggy explains that she saw the ear rub and notices that that's his cue that he's lying. Peggy explains that it is best never to lie to her again. This is when Jarvis goes back to talk to Howard for a little bit, and then Howard talks to Stan Lee for a little bit. Stan Lee makes a funny cameo asking if he can look at the sports section of the newspaper. Well, anyway, Peggy goes to the SSR building and is going to get lunch orders or whatever. And Sousa looks at the picture of the blonde that they got from the first episode. And he starts thinking about it and takes a pencil and draws over the blonde hair. Now, this seems a little bit weird considering we don't actually see a face, so I don't know what he's trying to get at. But, we'll probably figure out later. Well, Dooley's back, and he says he knows who... He says that the Germans weren't responsible for killing the Russians, and that they also know Howard Stark is back in town. Well, Peggy decides to go home, and she turns on the radio. Back in the other room, Dottie is studying the automatic weapon with Mr. Mink tied up under her bed. 'Cause that's not creepy at all. Peggy starts hammering into the wall, and Angie walks up to Dottie's door, wondering if she's going to come to dinner. Dottie says, yeah, I'll be there in a minute. And Peggy decides that she's going to hide the last vial of Captain America's blood into her wall, and then fixes the wall and makes it look like nothing's there. And then we get a shot of the mysterious typewriter, and it starts moving. Well, that's pretty much it for the episode, and this is when we cut to the promo. Peggy makes a very Captain America-like speech, and she's going to Russia with the rest of the Howling Commandos. But apparently, she's leading them into a trap. I'm excited about this next episode because I really like the Howling Commandos. Well, that's pretty much it for me. I think the only thing I have left to say is that Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. is coming back at March. And they made a really cool promo that they showed during the episode, which shows Skye trying to get used to her new powers. In case any of you were curious. Well, that's pretty much it for me. Thanks for watching another episode of The Mediator. I'll be back next week for the next episode of Agent Carter, and hopefully I'll be getting some more interesting videos, like topic videos, up on the channel, so it's not just after shows. Thank you guys so much for watching. When the comics come to screens, you know who to call.